They thought she was just another black driver, until she gave them a reason to regret every word they said. As Rachel Carter gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turned white. Today was supposed to be a milestone. Her first day as the new chief of police in Westbridge, a city notorious for its deep-seated biases. But instead of walking into her new office with confidence, she found herself staring at the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Two officers stepped out of the squad car, their expressions unreadable, but their body language spoke volumes. One of them, a middle-aged man with a hardened face, gave her car a dismissive glance before the younger one barked out, "License and registration." No greeting, no explanation, just suspicion. Rachel complied, her jaw clenched. She had seen this play out before, officers using flimsy justifications to harass people who looked like her. The air grew thick with tension. Then came the line that sent her blood boiling. "This isn't the safest place for someone like you." Rachel Carter exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. The heat of the afternoon sun bore down on her, but the real pressure came from the two officers standing outside her car, their stares drilling into her like she was already guilty of something. The younger one, Officer Blake, flipped through her documents without interest, as if he had already decided they wouldn't check out. The older officer, Sergeant McKinley, stood with his arms crossed, watching her with a mix of indifference and silent judgment. "What brings you to this side of town?" Blake asked, his voice sharp, demanding. Rachel kept her eyes on them, reading their body language. This wasn't just a routine stop. This was a power play. "I live here," she said evenly. Blake scoffed. "You live here? In Westbridge? Huh, interesting. You don't exactly look like someone who fits in around here." Rachel's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, but she kept her expression neutral. She had faced worse. She had fought through worse, but that didn't make this moment any easier. McKinley stepped closer. His posture was relaxed, but there was an edge in his voice that made it clear he wasn't interested in polite conversation. "Mind telling us what you do for a living?" Rachel knew the game they were playing. The longer they dragged this out, the more frustrated she would become. They wanted to provoke her, to make her slip up, to give them any excuse to escalate the situation. But she wasn't about to play into their hands. "I work in law enforcement," she said simply. Blake raised an eyebrow. "Law enforcement, huh?" He looked at McKinley with a smirk. "That's rich. What are you, a security guard? A private investigator?" Rachel didn't answer. She knew what was coming next. "See?" Blake continued, flipping her license back and forth in his hand. "We've had some issues with stolen vehicles in this area. This car, pretty nice for someone in law enforcement. You sure it's yours?" That was it. The final straw. Rachel felt the anger bubbling up, hot and furious. She had worked her entire life to reach this position, to be the one calling the shots. And now, on her first day as chief of police, she was being treated like a criminal by the very men she was supposed to lead. She took a slow breath, keeping her voice measured. "I don't have to explain myself to you." Blake's smirk disappeared. McKinley stepped forward, his face darkening. "Now hold on, ma'am. That's not the attitude you want to have right now. We could detain you for further questioning." Rachel's patience snapped. She met McKinley's gaze head-on, her voice like steel. "Enough. I'm Chief Rachel Carter, your new boss, and I want to know exactly why you thought this stop was necessary." The silence that followed was deafening. For a split second, everything froze. The smirk vanished from Officer Blake's face, replaced by sheer confusion. Sergeant McKinley's posture stiffened, his jaw tightening as if he had just been struck. Neither of them spoke. The weight of Rachel Carter's words hung in the air like a ticking time bomb. "You're the chief?" McKinley finally managed, his voice uncertain, like he was trying to convince himself he'd misheard her. Rachel didn't blink. "Yes, Chief Rachel Carter, and I'd like to know exactly why you pulled me over and why this interrogation continued long after it was clear I had done nothing wrong." Blake's fingers twitched at his belt, as if he wanted to grab his radio and disappear into thin air. His confidence, his arrogance, had drained out of him in an instant. The realization hit him like a freight train. He hadn't just harassed some random black woman. He had harassed his new boss. McKinley recovered first, his voice suddenly softer, almost apologetic. "Chief, this was just a standard traffic stop. We had no idea." Rachel held up a hand, cutting him off. "No, Sergeant. Don't do that. Don't backtrack now. You knew exactly what you were doing. This wasn't about enforcing the law. This was about power, about control. You assumed I didn't belong here. You assumed I was a threat before you even knew my name." McKinley's lips parted as if to argue, but nothing came out. He knew there was no defense for what had just happened. Blake, still looking like he'd been hit with a baseball bat, tried to salvage what little was left of his dignity. "Chief, we didn't mean anything by it. It was just a misunderstanding." Rachel let out a slow, measured breath, forcing herself to stay composed. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, her voice laced with controlled fury. "How many other misunderstandings like this happen in Westbridge? How many people have you stopped for no reason other than the way they look? And how many of them didn't have a badge to shield them?" Neither officer spoke. The silence was damning. Rachel stepped out of the car, the heat from the pavement radiating up around her. She could see it now. The way McKinley shifted uncomfortably, the way Blake avoided eye contact. They weren't just embarrassed. They were scared. Scared because they knew they had just exposed the very problem she had come here to fix. "You will be reporting to me," she said, her tone sharp as a blade. "For the next week, I want a full log of every traffic stop you conduct. Names, reasons, outcomes, and I will be reviewing them personally. If I see even a hint of racial profiling, I will not hesitate to take action." McKinley swallowed hard. "Understood, Chief." Blake's face had gone pale. He nodded stiffly. Rachel didn't need to say anything else. She turned, got back into her car, and started the engine. As she pulled away, she saw them in her rearview mirror, standing frozen, finally forced to face the reality of what they had done. Rachel Carter drove away, gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. The adrenaline still pulsed through her veins, but beneath it was something deeper, something colder, a simmering rage. This wasn't just about two officers stopping the wrong person. This was about a system that had allowed them to act this way in the first place. A system that had given them the confidence to pull over a black driver with no cause, interrogate her like a suspect, and only backpedal when they realized they had cornered themselves. She had spent years fighting for a position where she could make real change. Now, on her very first day, she had been given an unfiltered look at the exact problem she had come here to fix, and she wasn't going to waste a second. By the time she reached the precinct, she had already made up her mind. Inside, the station buzzed with the usual morning chaos, phones ringing, officers typing reports, a few detectives huddled over a case file. But as Rachel stepped through the doors, the energy shifted. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. They all knew who she was. Rachel walked straight to the center of the room. "Everyone, conference room. Now." The weight of her authority was undeniable. Officers exchanged quick glances, some hesitating, some already scrambling to obey. Within minutes, the entire department had filed into the room, the air thick with tension. She didn't waste time. "This morning I had the misfortune of experiencing firsthand exactly what's broken in this department." Her voice was sharp, slicing through the silence. "I was pulled over, questioned, and nearly detained for nothing. No traffic violation, no reasonable suspicion, just a routine exercise in intimidation." A murmur rippled through the room. She could see it. The officers shifting in their seats, some visibly uncomfortable, others unreadable. She locked eyes with McKinley and Blake, who stood near the back, shoulders squared but faces tight with unease. "Here's what I need you all to understand," Rachel continued, her voice unwavering. "That kind of policing? The kind that sees a black driver and assumes they don't belong? The kind that hides behind standard procedure to justify harassment? It ends today." Silence. No one dared move. "I will be reviewing every single traffic stop report moving forward. If I see a pattern, if I find one more example of profiling, intimidation, or abuse of power, there will be consequences. And I promise you, they will be severe." A few officers clenched their jaws. Some nodded, a flicker of understanding in their eyes. Others remained rigid, their expressions guarded. Rachel scanned the room. She could feel the resistance in some of them, The challenge in their stares. Good, let them resist. Let them underestimate her, because by the time she was done, they wouldn't anymore. The room sat in dead silence, the weight of Rachel Carter's words pressing down like a storm cloud ready to break. She scanned their faces, reading every flicker of resistance, every clenched jaw, every pair of narrowed eyes. Some officers looked genuinely shaken, a few nodded in silent agreement, but others bristled. She knew what they were thinking. Who does she think she is? She's only been here a day. This is how we've always done things. Rachel had seen this before. The quiet rebellion that festers under a system too long left unchallenged. But what they didn't realize, what they were about to learn, was that she didn't come here to ask permission. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This isn't about embarrassing anyone. This isn't about making headlines. This is about the kind of police department we're going to be from this moment forward." She let the words sink in before continuing. "If you are here to serve and protect every citizen, not just the ones you're comfortable with, then we're on the same team. But if you think you can keep doing things the old way, if you believe in pulling people over just because they look out of place, if you think the badge gives you the right to intimidate rather than uphold the law." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. "Then let me save you the trouble. You won't last under my command." A ripple of movement. A few officers straightened in their seats. Others exchanged quick glances. Sergeant McKinley shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't a fool. He knew the gravity of what had happened. He knew Rachel could have made an example of him and Officer Blake right here, right now. The fact that she hadn't, that was mercy, but it wouldn't last forever. Blake, on the other hand, wasn't as quick to adapt. His arms were crossed tight over his chest, his expression locked in quiet defiance. Rachel noticed. "Blake," she said, her tone even. He snapped to attention. "Tell me something," she continued, her voice controlled but edged with steel. "What exactly did you see when you pulled me over this morning? A suspicious driver? A potential criminal?" Blake hesitated. His jaw tensed. He glanced at McKinley, who was smart enough to keep his mouth shut. "I saw someone in an area that didn't quite match," Blake finally muttered. Rachel exhaled sharply. There it was, the quiet part spoken aloud. "And that's the problem," she said. More silence. "This department will not operate on instinctive bias. You will learn to see people as citizens first, not threats. If you can't, you have no place here." She took a step back, eyes still locked on Blake. "Starting today, you all have a choice, either adapt or step aside." And then, without another word, she walked out. The storm had arrived. Rachel Carter walked out of the conference room, leaving behind a room full of officers who had just been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. She could feel the weight of their stares on her back, some burning with quiet resentment, others filled with something more dangerous, uncertainty. She didn't care, she had seen it before. Resistance, pushback. The old guard clinging to their ways, convinced that change was an attack instead of an evolution. But she hadn't come here to preserve their comfort. She had come to dismantle the very foundation that had allowed men like McKinley and Blake to act with impunity. As she stepped into her office for the first time, the reality of the situation settled over her. She wasn't just fighting two officers. She was fighting a culture, a system that had been molded over decades, reinforced by silence and complicity. And if today had been any indication, she was about to walk straight into a war. A sharp knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Lieutenant Daniels, one of the few officers she had researched before taking the job. An older black man, someone who had managed to survive in this department without losing himself. His expression was unreadable as he stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "Hell of a first day, Chief." Rachel let out a dry chuckle, shaking her head. "Not exactly what I had planned." Daniels exhaled, crossing his arms. "You made some enemies in there." "Good," she shot back. "That means they were paying attention." He studied her for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "You've got guts. But guts won't be enough. These men, they don't like being told they're wrong. Some of them will fight you. Some will try to wait you out, hoping you'll get frustrated and quit. And some? He paused, his voice lowering. Some will try to make sure you don't last long enough to make real changes. Rachel met his gaze, unflinching. Let them try. Daniel smirked. Figured you'd say that. A tense silence stretched between them before he spoke again. You've got at least a dozen officers who believe in what you're doing, but you've got twice as many who think you're a problem. Rachel leaned forward, her fingers tapping against the desk. Then we're going to find out exactly who's who. Daniels raised an eyebrow. First thing tomorrow, I want a full audit of every stop, every complaint, every use of force report in the last 3 years, Rachel said. I want to know who's been playing by the rules and who's been using this badge as a weapon. Daniels let out a low whistle. You really are here to burn it down, huh? Rachel smiled, but there was no humor in it. I'm here to build something better. And as the sun set on her first day, she knew one thing for certain. This fight was just beginning. Cette histoire nous rappelle une vérité essentielle. Le pouvoir et l'uniforme ne devraient jamais être des outils d'intimidation, mais des symboles de protection et d'équité. Trop souvent, les préjugés s'infiltrent dans les institutions censées garantir la justice, prouvant que le combat contre la discrimination ne s'arrête jamais. Rachel Carter a fait face à l'adversité avec calme et détermination, prouvant que la vraie force réside dans la maîtrise de soi et la connaissance de ses droits. Son histoire nous enseigne qu'il ne suffit pas d'occuper une position de pouvoir, encore faut-il l'utiliser pour instaurer un véritable changement. Dans nos propres vies, nous pouvons apprendre à ne pas rester silencieux face à l'injustice, à remettre en question les pratiques douteuses et à exiger des comptes. Chaque geste compte, chaque voix a de l'importance. Il est temps de réfléchir à nos propres biais et de nous demander « Dans quelle mesure contribuons-nous à un monde plus juste ?» Si cette histoire vous a inspiré, n'hésitez pas à liker, partager et commenter votre avis. Abonnez-vous pour d'autres récits qui font réfléchir et éveillent les consciences.